Hello, welcome. We're covering revisionist history of the Civil War. So I will share it with this. Now, as you may remember, court history of the Civil War contends that there arose an anomalously idealistic and confrontational and even defiant generation in the antebellum period that forced, despite their small numbers, uh, through the written and spoken word and through the mail, etc., and other means of disproportionately getting their voices out there, forced discourse on the subject of slavery. And of course, right, in addition to this idealistic antebellum generation rocking the boat, is you have polarizing events concerning slavery and its extension into the West. And so you have the abrogation of the 3630 Missouri Compromise line in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The fact that the democratic process did not work and it devolved into anarchy and violence in the episode of Bleeding Kansas. So popular sovereignty, the nice euphemism for the day, Stephen Douglas did not save the day. Then you have the intrusion into northern states by way of the local and state enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution. Clearly, it was put in there at the federal level, but was not always uh, inaugurated at the local and state level. Matter of fact, you had some states issue liberty laws in which they stated they would not enforce the Fugitive Slave Clause until now. And so then we've gone over, there was one section in there that hints and insinuates that the faction of the slave power was very aggressive and increasingly uh, the word I'm thinking of, darn it, the adjective, entitled. And so some people, resented that. You have the Dred Scott case, whereby the Roger B. Taney and the Supreme Court engaged in judicial activism, whereby they tried to enforce the Fifth Amendment to be applied into free states and in free territories as well, which could theoretically spread slavery virtually anywhere, according to the Republicans. You have the formation of a regional anti-slave spreading party in the Republican Party. You have the radicals that branch from the Republicans, the mainstream Republicans. We talked about Salmon Chase. We talked about Charles Sumner, Wendell Phillips, Wade Davis. Several were mentioned. And as you could read in there, and they made a lot of noise, and they began to likewise, as they perceived the Southern faction to be doing, became more stubborn and more confrontational in their political tactics and stance. And so then you had the evolution, the alleged evolution of Lincoln, whereby he got over his personal apathy as well as his constitutional issues with ending slavery. And you have the notion of the precedent of the founding fathers in the Northwest Ordinance prohibiting slavery in federal territory and tied to the intended thesis that the founding fathers intended slavery to eventually die out and not spread westwardly. Yeah, and so we've gone over all of that, and now we're going to be more critical. All right. So technically, right, it took the Northern government a long time to come around in abolishing slavery. And when Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, as you probably already know, it only declared free the slaves of rebels who refused to put down their arms. So he cut a deal, for instance, with the legislator and the state virtually of Kentucky, whereby they were able to keep their slaves in return for their loyalty to the Union. So yikes, right? Then you also have um, the fact that they issued confiscation acts, and that could have been a way of trying to get around legal niceties, but it just appeared to be very, very impersonal and vindictive toward the South, right? Benjamin Butler and these other generals for the Union Army showed a lot of disinterest, annoyance, condescension, and indifference toward the freed slaves, the runaway slaves, the contrabands, as they called them, running along with the Union Army and put them to work at doing the work that no one else wanted to do, burying the dead, cooking and cleaning, etc., etc. There was a distrust of putting guns in their arms, and so hence the hesitance of the federal government to do so. Um, and then also even with land redistribution, with Field Order number 15 and other instances of, the beginnings of the notion of 40 acres and a mule to each freedman family, Edisto Island, if you wanted to look that up. Some people contend that yes, while on behalf of the Freedmen's Bureau, there was probably some idealism behind it. Just the very people that were chosen, the people that led it, O. Howard and others, uh, some idealism there, some proof thereof. But with the Union Army, yikes, right? That's where you get Dunning's thesis, William Dunning. He contends that the North did what it did for the African Americans and the slaves to pretty much split, divide, and psychologically and materially conquer the white South, almost out of vindictiveness, not out of idealism or altruism. So that's something to think about with the leaders, with the leadership. And then Lincoln, right? He writes to Horace Greeley when Horace Greeley asked him about his priorities regarding the emancipation of slaves. He makes it pretty callously clear, at least in what he's wanting to convey to the public, that his first priority is to save the Union, not to free the slaves. And if he could do so by keeping the slaves enslaved, then he will. If he can do so by emancipating them, then very well, he will as well. But his first priority is to save the Union and to get the 11 Southern states back in. So that's pretty callous, incriminating quote of Lincoln's. Also, in his Lincoln Douglas debates, we mentioned some, some more romanticized quotes, like when I paraphrased him with his back against the wall, asking if he alone would unilaterally declare slavery invalid in the Western territories. And he told Stephen Douglas, yes, he would. So, hence this idea of him being the tyrant, sic semper tyrannis. But also in those debates, his back was put up against the wall and being an inward lover and wanting social integration, which was arguably the most radical of stances at that time, right? To intermarry with black families, etc., and socially integrate. He backed down, very cowardly, and he said, "No, no, no, I am not in favor of the social and political, nor political equality of the black and white races." So note again that you could be for emancipating the slaves, but giving them full enfranchisement, full citizenship rights is a whole other issue, right? And as we know, like with the Dutch, with the Romans, etc., you could have levels of citizenship. You could have the basic level of economic rights to be remunerated for your labor in the form of wages, to be able to buy and rent property, to take out loans, start a business, etc. Then, arguably, a second level would be political protection under the law, under criminal law, especially. And then thirdly, suffrage, right? The right to participate in politics, to run for office, to vote, etc. And so you could be anywhere on that spectrum, or nowhere on that spectrum, and still be for emancipating the slaves for a myriad of reasons. We talked about the free soilers, right? Wanting jobs only for white men that were paid wages and had a chance to rise up the social, political, and the economic spectrum, right? The American dream being available, and that only jobs that afforded wages and an opportunity to ascend would get the best out of your workers and be the most, they would be the most efficient if they were remunerated and rewarded. So hence, some people just merely contended that slavery was archaic and inefficient, not necessarily immoral. So you had a myriad of stances you could take. You had a myriad of reasons for which you could oppose slavery, right? And not be anything akin to an abolitionist. So at any rate, yeah, so you have the leadership. And so you have evidence of, in revisionist history, you have evidence of leadership showing great reluctance in freeing the slaves and arming them, etc. And then in the arming part, right, you have quotes from Ulysses Grant, you have quotes from George Julian, and quotes from Lincoln himself, contending, almost boasting of the psychological edge and also the material advancement of putting arms in the hands of ex-slaves and marching them down the Mississippi into the South to get their revenge. And so, once again, the Dunning thesis, right? You could have more of a utilitarian motive in wanting to use these ex-slaves as soldiers and not necessarily anything that was close to humanitarian concerns for them. And so that is something to think about. The ubiquity of racism up in the North is evident. Howard Zinn's book contends that of 19 states in the North, only five gave some citizenship rights to some black men. That's pretty weak, right? There were at least, I think, three states that had referendums during the war to enfranchise some black men, and only one of the three states had a referendum that passed. Only one of three. So again, by the end of the war, you only have six of 19 northern states giving some citizenship rights to some black men. That's pretty weak. Also, right, you have the violent deaths of abolitionists in northern states, like Elijah Lovejoy. Okay, and so they clearly were risking their lives in the North, uh, espousing their abolitionist take on things, right? Then, in addition to that, you also have the draft riots. In the draft riots, they chanted that they would not die for the N-words. They attacked black orphanages and black churches. And so hence it wasn't just the rich that they were going after, because the rich could pay $250 and have someone fight in their place as a substitute. And so future robber barons like Carnegie and Rockefeller did so. But yet they still, right, they targeted African Americans, contending they did not want to die themselves, have their brothers, their sons die for these black people that they've never met. Okay. And so clearly some apathy and some opposition in the North as well as in the South, right? And then not only the utility of using black slaves became, widely pronounced, but also just a sense of desperation is argued by some revisionist historians. By, supposedly you have a book that in April of 1862, the war started to turn around, arguably, but it was far from definitively evident that the North was going to win in April of 62. So by the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln was concerned that it was going to become too obvious to others all around the world that the Emancipation Proclamation was made out of desperation. So he was looking for something that just made it not look as such, right? And so he got from what was good enough for him What he derived from was a darn stalemate, not even a victory, at Antietam when the South tried to invade the capital. And so they fought to a stalemate, and the South did leave. So in a sense, it was like a Union victory, and that was good enough for him. And he was like, "Okay, great. Now it doesn't look like we're quite as desperate. So let's go ahead and issue that Emancipation Proclamation now." So a lot of people, right, like what you see with his Gettysburg Address, he's really trying to appeal to people's idealism by the time of the Gettysburg Address, because he's seeing that people are tiring of the war. And hence you have the copperheads of the Democratic Party up in the North. McClellan ran as their presidential candidate. And Lincoln was literally afraid he was going to lose re-election. And remember, not a southern state was a part of it. Tennessee largely stayed loyal. Missouri was split as border states, and Kentucky fought with the Union. But I'm not aware of them having reps in Congress. Maybe Tennessee, if I recall correctly, but that's it. So they don't have Southerners by and large in Congress and in the Electoral College. And yet he's still worried about losing in the North to Democrats who said this war is unnecessary and we shouldn't be fighting it and we shouldn't be dying for African Americans or nor dying to keep 11 Southern states from leaving. So at any rate, that's something to think about. And with Lincoln, right, and with the administration, the Republican administration, that they perhaps were desperate. They saw that the people were war weary, and not to mention all the casualties, right? With over 600,000 casualties, by far the most casualties we've had in any war. And so they they wanted to give meaning, say the revisionists. They wanted to bring a sense of purpose so that people would continue to fight on and not feel as if they've died for nothing or just merely died to keep 11 states from leaving or merely died, sadly, for black people they've never met. So at any rate, he gives his Gettysburg Address, and he says that fourscore 7 years ago that our founding fathers brought forth on the earth an enlightened, special, idealistic republic that was predicated on the notion that all men are created equal. So now, finally, he's making it about a crusade and saying that it's a special, enlightened type of republic that we are trying to keep together, and that is worth dying for. All right. And so some people believe that he kind of finally put that together out of desperation and trying to make sense of in the minds of his people, his constituents, the loss of so many people, of so many soldiers. So that is something to think about with revisionist history. And remember that these are not mutually exclusive. There could be some truth to each thesis, right? The Crusade thesis, as well as the much more cynical thesis, right? That it was done out of self-interest, desperation. Uh, it was a low priority, really, in the war, etc. And remember, the faction thesis always is strongly represented in revisionist historiography. And the faction thesis is that they were fighting for allies in the West. Every new Western state will have two senators, no matter what, and one House rep for every 30,000 civilians. And so you get people who do the same thing that you do for a living, they're likely going to become your factional ally and vote the same way you do in Congress. And you get the numbers and you get to run government as Congress makes the laws. All right. And so it could have been a lot about power, etc. Okay, as well. So anyway, that's the revisionist take on the Civil War. And then from there, I would like to go to, if I could get my mouse to work, I want to go to, let's see here, the other one, which is a one that is centered on choices that you have. Okay, with this one, please choose to address, answer, and support your answer to one of the following questions concerning the Civil War, the actual fighting. All right. Cite the logistical, resource, and strategy facets that helped the North win this long, bloody war. A 4-year war is arguably long enough to call a war of attrition, arguably, all right, uh, outlasting your opponent. And so, how is that proven here with the Civil War? You could look at um, McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, the second or third chapter. He begins with some good stats on the border states alone and how much they afforded in men, in resources. It's pretty uh, significant, for lack of a better adjective. All right. Also, you might want to be familiarize yourself with the Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan was to literally squeeze the South into a blockade-like mechanism, and so mainly through the Navy, right? Taking the Gulf of Mexico, taking the Atlantic coast, and taking the Mississippi River, and trying to squeeze dry the South. All right, so you had the Anaconda Plan that was put into effect, and you could see to what you could look up to what extent that was successful. And then also, I don't know of a name being put to it, but it's a very, very simple concept that Lincoln tried uh, to suggest on more than one occasion with more than one leader of the Union Army, and they just would not stubbornly seem to employ it until Ulysses Grant. And that was, right, is especially before the death of Stonewall Jackson and when the South had controlled the Shenandoah Valley, which was their breadbasket, they were very, very adept at sending uh, surplus soldiers, right, to the front where the main brunt of a Union attack was to rectify the imbalance of numbers. So oftentimes, right, they'd be across a broad swath of land, and the Union Army very often outnumbered the South. I mean, overall, right, you could look the stat up, but some people go so far as that it was almost a 3-to-1 ratio in superiority of the North. So the North usually outnumbered the South, okay, the Confederate Army. The main army was the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. And but yet they would do a pincer move quite often, and it became rather predictable. So the South would know when they would hit a flank and which flank they were hitting and trying to break through, and they would send their surplus soldiers in that area so that at any given moment in the heat of battle, the numbers were usually roughly equal, and in many cases superior for that of the South. Okay, despite the superiority of Union numbers. And so the very simple concept that Lincoln was trying to convey was hit the South in multiple fronts simultaneously because they can't send their surplus soldiers everywhere at once. And it was a very simple concept that was not utilized very well until Ulysses Grant. And you'll see that there was one leader after another for the Union as far as blundering thesis. My goodness. You have George Meade, who fought rather defensively and fought well at Antietam. And Meade was good at fighting defensively, for sure, but nothing really offensive as far as a threat to ending the war. You had Joseph Hooker, and Joseph Hooker was quite brilliant and quite, even to the point of reckless, with the ingenuity of some of his moves and so forth, until Chancellorsville. And he just had like a mental breakdown, an emotional breakdown, according to the primary sources, and just kind of just disappeared from the record. You have Burnside, and Burnside had a terrible reputation for being reckless when he should be cautious, and cautious when he should take risks. And so that was Burnside by and large. You have McClellan, and McClellan would have a superiority in numbers and be convinced that it was the other way around, that he was the one that was outnumbered and would refuse to attack in multiple instances when he was supposed to try to take Richmond. And so those are some of the most salient examples that stand out of failed leadership up in the North prior to Ulysses S. Grant. But when you look at Grant and you look at his wilderness campaign, look and see how adept he was, how bold he was, how aggressive he was in hitting multiple spots simultaneously. Not to mention using ore in the Navy, ORR, and using William Tecumseh Sherman to keep them from escaping from the south direction. So at any rate, that's something to think about. But you know, as far as the ability to create um, gunpowder, guns, boots and uniforms, food, provisions, uniforms. The North was greatly in an advantageous position to the South, and you could look those stats up. Okay. Matter of fact, just with guns alone, most of the major gun factories were found um, in the New England states alone. And then also, as far as gunpowder, you could find evidence of the extent to which the South was so desperate in trying alternative means of devising gunpowder. All right. So number two, demonstrate how the Confederacy may have won the Civil War if certain variables had played out differently. So you have, right, the first and second battles of Bull Run. You have Jubal Early, Jubal, and then Early as in early to something, Early. Those were instances in which arguably the South could have taken the nation's capital and quite possibly have taken Abraham Lincoln as a hostage. All right, supposedly, according to multiple secondary sources. All right. Um, you have how close the South got to winning at Gettysburg. Look up Cemetery Ridge. Uh, the left flank at Gettysburg was almost taken. The men at one point ran out of ammunition and went on a desperate bayonet charge to try to keep the hill and try to keep the left flank. You have other instances. Also, Great Britain. You could see just how closely Great Britain came to diplomatically gaining and acquiring an alliance with a confederacy. You could look that up as well. All right. And so, anyway, so yeah, demonstrate how the Confederacy may have won. So they call that contingency in history, the what ifs and the whole butterfly effect if things had gone in a different direction. All right. Some people even go so far as putting that much magnitude to the death of Stonewall Jackson. Yeah, so anyway, let's see here. Number three, how well did, quote, Negro soldiers, such as the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts, assist the cultural, military, and political aims of the abolitionists? Because remember, it's you, if you choose number three, remember that this question is meant to include symbolism as well as literal material help. All right. So, for instance, the 54th Regiment, they were more than decimated. Over half their regiment was obliterated in the Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina, and of course, including losing their white leader Robert Gould Shaw. So they lost so many men in just one night, and they never took the fort. The fort was never taken during the war, and so it was a loss, right? But it was seen to be, you know, the opposite of a Pyrrhic victory, right? A Pyrrhic victory is when you win, but in the long run, the win was so costly, it was like a loss. This was like they lost, but in the long run, it was like they won because they won credibility for the loyalty intelligence, bravery, and discipline. Because remember, right, the Sambo image was not just in the South. The Sambo image prevailed, sadly, in the North as well, through minstrel shows and other means of the media and migration and trade, etc. So they're fighting against the Sambo image. They're fighting against the whole we have the wolf by the ears thought that from memories of past injustices, if you put guns in the hands of ex-slaves, they're going to turn against you, all right, and not be disciplined. So you have all these other these doubts, these sources of doubt, these sources of distrust of African Americans being employed as soldiers. And so look at kind of a domino effect after the 54th Regiment was annihilated at Wagner. Okay. You have spokesmen, of course, Frederick Douglass, and these other spokesmen, and the Freedmen's Bureau. Uh, Take a look at those organizations and see how they proliferated news of the black man and his fighting prowess and his loyalty, etc. Look at enlistments after the Battle of Fort Wagner. Look at sympathy for the Fort Pillow massacre, when African American would-be prisoners of war who were surrendering after they had used all of their bullets and were massacred by white Southern racists in Tennessee. Okay. Number four, should you choose that one? Settle in your juxtaposition, praise for, and criticism of Ulysses S. Grant. All right. So with Grant, it kind of runs with the next one as well. Consider the context of Civil War realities and condemn or defend William Tecumseh Sherman. All right. This one, right? I remember in high school years ago, um, how they they romanticized this story of both of them. All right. It was the whole kind of underdog story. All right. Absolutely. If you read a biography of both of these men, they went through a lot of disappointment, a lot of failure, not only earlier in their life, but early in the Civil War. And you could find evidence for both of them on that. I don't know how much I should go through, right here and now on that. But as an example, Ulysses Grant, in addition to economic privation, to such an extent that one of the future um, officers of the Confederate Army took pity on him and offered him a loan of money because he looked so poor and impoverished. And of course, he was too proud to take it. But at any rate, in addition to that, he went to Washington, D.C. asking for a position, and Lincoln didn't even have time to meet with him, much less give him a regiment. So he had to get it from his dad. And that's a whole other story because his dad supposedly played favorites with his older brother when he was discharged for alcoholism, um, and didn't do so well in West Point. His dad was disappointed in him when he had to move back home, then move with his in-laws. There was a great sense of emasculation. And then, of course, he starts looking for a fight in Tennessee. And if you look at a couple of his early battles, he was given permission to eventually attack Forts Henry and Donelson, but he was to wait until he was given the ultimate okay. And he didn't wait. He just attacked. And he knew he was in trouble. And so he thought, you know what, I'm going to look for another glorious victory after he took those two forts to get myself out of trouble. And instead, he got himself surrounded at Shiloh, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. And he got help by one of his superiors, or Carlos Buell, in fighting his way out of the trap. And they court-martialed him. But Lincoln, right, pardons him and says, I can't spare this man. He fights. This guy likes to fight. So he had a chip on his shoulder. He called his older brother the Golden Boy, and he also called Robert E. Lee the Golden Boy. So the whole psychological, uh, you know, um, projection of his own personal issues growing up are projected onto him having this chip on his shoulder to prove himself in war. So, at any rate, in the Wilderness Campaign, there's a quote from Robert E. Lee where he says, "Good God, what does this man want of me? Like, this is getting personal. This guy's coming after me so aggressively, right?" And so he's going to eventually bottle him up at Appomattox, and it'll be the end of the war virtually when the Army of Northern Virginia surrenders. However, prior to that, right, in some of the battles of Wilderness, he was told, "Sir, we're likely fighting into a trap." And he would callously say, "Well, we have more soldiers to lose than they do, so just fight through the trap." So he was known as a butcher to some of his critics, who was callously willing, all too willing, to sacrifice his troops for his own bruised ego. Then, in addition to that, he tells Sherman, "Your haste going through the Deep South is of the utmost importance, right? To bottle Lee up and to keep him from escaping southwardly. So it is imperative that you get there as quickly as possible. So, therefore, if you must disregard the Articles of War, do so." And the Articles of War, right? Remember, they had just in the 1850s had the Crimean War, and this is the beginning of the Geneva Accords and the Geneva Convention. And that the whole idea is being solidified, what goes back arguably all the way to the 400s with the Catholic Church and St. Augustine of Hippo, known as just war doctrine, right? That you fight for the right reasons and you fight in the right manner, right? In order for it to be a righteous cause. And that's going to form the foundation of a secularized version of it, coming through people like Hugo Grotius, a Dutch humanist of the 1600s. So at any rate, he told Sherman, "Don't worry about the Articles of War," and Sherman did not. Sherman is depicted as emotionally fragile. Um, he was a professor at West Point. He finds out that most of the students and other professors are going to side with the South when Civil War breaks out. He from Ohio, of course, will stay loyal to the Union, just as Grant from Illinois in the Ohio Valley as well stays loyal to the Union. So he weeps and hugs them. He sees one of them at the Battle of Bull Run and hesitates and freezes as they blast um, artillery into his men. It was such an extended frozen state that he was tried for it. Uh, he was punished. He was relinquished of his command, and he was given a desk job in Tennessee. He succumbed to alcoholism. Supposedly, they had him at one point on suicide watch. Um, and Grant decides to give him another shot. And eventually, he has his men in more than one southern city sniped off their cavalry horses. And something in him finally snaps. And he tells his men, "Gather 100 citizens from this town." And they're like, "Well, which ones?" He says, "Just randomly, pick 100." And he says, "If nobody knows who's sniping my men by noon, these people are going to be publicly executed." And thankfully, he didn't go through with that, but he threatened it. And that's the beginning of him violating the Articles of War and just, for lack of a more sophisticated articulation of it, fighting dirty. Okay. He blew up railroad lines, telegraph wires to mess up their infrastructure. He told his men to go in and take what they wanted. This was the same guy, right? Who had one guy steal a Southern cotton gin and he wrote him up for it. Not any longer, right? He allows his men to pretty much rape and pillage. They come, they take what they want from the Southern plantations, and then they burn them to the ground, as well as their harvests. All right. And also by this time, they had finally taken the Shenandoah Valley and they burned the Shenandoah Valley so that it will no longer feed the South. So they're fighting pretty dirty to win, right? And he's trying to break the will of the South. And matter of fact, he boasts of it, right? He says his famous boast was, "I made Georgia howl," right? Howl like a wolf, crying out. And so he burns Atlanta, Georgia to the ground. Um, he goes up into South Carolina and proceeds to do the same thing, back up the coast. And so they surround Lee, and it does work, so that Lee surrenders. But again, right? You look at chances that in Bull Run, both Bull Runs, you look at Jubal Early riding into Washington, D.C., and other instances in which the South could have really gotten dirty against Washington, D.C., and they just didn't. They didn't fight that way. But of course, you had, don't get me wrong, you had Fort Pillow massacre against African American soldiers, and you had atrocities on both sides, no doubt. But like I said, this type of planned, deliberate, just wholesale destruction of infrastructure, of cities, of water supplies. I didn't get into that, but that was Grant at Vicksburg. He had his men go to the bathroom in the water supply of the city of Vicksburg, in addition to his other plans of blockading that city, that proud city. And so they were willing to get vicious in winning, right? So that's why I have subtle in your juxtaposition. I remember juxtaposition was when two things are side by side and they seem to contradict each other. Praise for and criticism of Ulysses Grant. Or you could choose, consider the context, right? The surrounding situation, the circumstances around the realities of William Tecumseh Sherman's biography. And can you understand why he finally snapped? Can you understand why, he was to make haste, and so he didn't have time to employ the Articles of War. So, for instance, one way in which he could have employed the Articles of War was giving a formal petition to each town and city that he went into, asking for a certain allotment of food, provisions, etc., giving them a formal IOU letter, etc., right? And he contended that he didn't have time for that. And he didn't have he ran out of the patience for that as well. Let's face it. All right. So please choose one of those. And I hope that you learn some about the material, the militaristic side of the fighting itself, of the Civil War. And as you know, this 4-year war is going to end with the victory of the Union. The 11 Southern states that had formed the Confederacy in the South have long been part of the United States again. Slavery was abolished by way of the 13th Amendment. And at the end of the war, our last subject that we will do is the North is going to try to reconstruct the South, so known as Reconstruction. Very fascinating topic. The very last one we do. All right. So I don't believe anybody's even on here, but if anyone is, does he or she have a question? All right. Okay. Well, I hope you guys are able to employ this video and if it's of some help for you. All right. You guys take care and hang in there. We're almost done.